As an MMORPG, communication is a major factor in World of Warcraft. The human element of communicating and working together with other people all over the world is a part of what makes WoW so special. Many players, myself included, will refer to the friendships and memories they've made as part of what keeps us playing. The spoken word can be a powerful force, and when you have a group of players all communicating and speaking, joking and laughing together as they kill villainous beasts, it's easy to see why communicating is so important. Beyond the gameplay implications of communication, by which I mean speaking to players to accomplish a task like finishing off a raid boss, the subsect of players who pay their $15 a month to tell stories together, or role players, have another use for communication. Since communicating to tell stories with characters is how they choose to play the game, it makes sense that the more players people can speak with, the more stories they have the opportunity to make, and the more fun they'll have. Some players, then, must be upset that the Horde and Alliance are gated off from speaking to each other by a language barrier. All races in WoW have their own language, with the exception of a few. The two-player factions also have a language that is used, Common for the Alliance, that all Alliance characters and citizens speak, and Orcish for the Horde, that all Horde characters and citizens speak. A mage with the Arcane Linguist skill can understand all languages of all allies, except for Pandaren and Demonic, the two languages that can be used to speak cross-faction. There is little purpose for using a different language besides roleplay. However, there are add-ons designed for roleplayers that allow a character to speak in another language. This doesn't actually change the character's ability to speak languages, but does make it appear so for everyone else using the same add-on, such as the add-on Tongues. The purpose for cross-faction communication is primarily roleplay, or, as it was utilized in the WoW beta, to abuse the enemy faction. At the start of the WoW pre-launch beta, Forsaken characters could speak Common. This feature was removed in patch 0.11, the second to last beta patch before the live release. This was, allegedly, removed due to consistent trolling or abuse of the Alliance by Forsaken members of the Horde, such as a higher-leveled Forsaken player who hung out under the bridge in Redridge, who lured low-level Alliance players to him using /yell or /say and then killed them. There's no basis in lore for the Forsaken having forgotten how to speak, or, more outrageously, somehow forgotten how to even understand Common, and was simply a gameplay designed to limit the Horde trolling of the Alliance. Since Forsaken had the ability to speak Common taken away from them in the beta, there was only one way to effectively communicate with members of the opposite faction, using pre-approved emotes. These emotes, accessed by typing a / command into the chat bar, such as /silly to tell a joke or /flirt to perform a flirt emote, would show up with the same description for all players who saw them, Horde or Alliance, regardless of who performed it. While there were custom emotes where a player could perform any action they wished by writing /e or /me and then typing out what they wished to perform, a player of the opposite faction would simply receive a message that indicated someone had tried to perform a custom emote, but the player was unable to understand them. It was also, however, possible for a priest to mind control someone of the opposite faction and then use custom emotes to communicate. Because the emotes were effectively being used by someone of the same faction as the intended recipients, the people of the same faction as the mind-controlled player, regardless of faction of the priest, were able to understand the emotes. At the beginning of the Wrath of the Lich King, when warlocks were granted the Metamorphosis ability, turning them into a massive demon, there became a new way for the two factions to communicate. While under the effects of Metamorphosis, a warlock automatically spoke and emoted in Demonic. This language was unintelligible by anyone who was not a warlock in Metamorphosis. However, other warlocks, regardless of faction, who were under the effect of Metamorphosis, could speak and understand Demonic to any other warlock under the effect of Metamorphosis, regardless of faction. For example, a Blood Elf warlock and a Gnome warlock could communicate for the duration of the Metamorphosis spell. When players gained the ability to rename companion pets, or battle pets, during the Mists of Pandaria, there suddenly became a new, if rather clunky, way to send a message to the opposite faction. It was entirely possible to name a pet which players of the opposite faction saw as it was written. For example, naming a pet "Hi there" and then /pointing at it would pop up in the chat box of the opposite faction. Player points at "Hi there." A player could then either rename that pet to something else such as "How are you?" or simply dismiss it and summon a different pet with another name and do the same thing, which the opposite faction would be also able to understand. It would be ineffective to communicate this way, but it is entirely possible. In the Legion pre-patch, when Demon Hunters were added, they were immediately able to communicate to each other, regardless of faction, by being granted the use of a class-specific language, Demonic. This Demonic language is the same language that Warlocks used during Metamorphosis. However, Metamorphosis was taken off of Warlocks and given exclusively to Demon Hunters, meaning Warlocks lost the ability to communicate using Demonic while in demon form. The demonic language that demon hunters use is also able to be selected as a normal racial language would be, whereas when the warlocks had the access to demonic, they did not have the choice of which language to use while in demon form. They simply were forced to speak demonic. Similarly, in the same pre-Legion patch, Pandaren were no longer relegated to having the racial language of Pandaren Alliance or Pandaren Horde, depending on the faction, and were instead granted the use of the racial language Pandaren that transcended the faction barrier. Since there's no basis in lore for the Pandaren having forgotten how to speak to one another after leaving the Wandering Isle, this was a great decision on the behalf of Blizzard. Besides using an in-game translator, such as Pandaren or Demon Hunter, to communicate using their cross-faction language, and then switching to their faction-specific language to relay a message, there are still a few ways a player can communicate with members of the other faction. Due to the way the faction languages are encoded in World of Warcraft, certain strings of random characters will translate into intelligible sentences for the opposite faction. For example, EEOODAP, said in Common, will translate to a player who doesn't speak Common as LOVEYOU, or love you. Similarly, a Horde player saying 1613 in Orcish will appear as ANAL to someone who doesn't speak Orcish, or anal in all caps. Clearly some things, such as anal spam, transcend such petty limitations as language barriers. With the addition of the battle tag system, it's also possible to just bypass the character and speak directly to the player. All you have to do is send a player a battle tag invite to add them to your B-tag friends list, and then you can talk to them as you wish, regardless of faction they play, or even if they're not playing WoW. There is also a rather convoluted method to speak to demon hunters of the other faction, but not understand what they say back. A warlock can cast Curse of Tongues on a player, who is then forced to speak in demonic. A demon hunter is able to understand this demonic, as it is the same language they can speak. This isn't particularly useful for anything, but it is a neat way to speak to demon hunters if you are not a demon hunter. Those are the ways to communicate with player characters in World of Warcraft. If I missed any that you know of, please be sure to let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video or found it informative, please also comment and let me know, as well as leaving a like and subscribing. I intend producing more informative content like this in the future, and I'd love to have you all watching.